anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour. We know your time is valuable. If you have questions during the course of the webinar, please type those in, and Matt is monitoring those questions, and we'll stop and answer your questions. We welcome questions. Please do that. So if Matt could take us to slide 2. We thought it would be very appropriate, given the issues that we've had not only in the state of South Dakota recently related to school safety, but also nationally, safety issues that seem to be more prevalent in our schools. We thought it was appropriate that rather than starting with Domain 1, we would actually start with Domain 4, the school, student, and staff safety. I think that's on everybody's minds right now. I'm aware that there have been trainings all over the state regarding school safety, and that is on our minds right now. If you could move to the next slide, please. This is just a review of the components that are within Domain 4. 4.1 is a safe environment, and that one, when we get to it, it really is about that physical safety. What are you doing in your building and with your staff and your students to ensure the physical safety of your students? 4.2, those clear and consistent expectations. 4.3, student behavior management, and 4.4, conflict resolution. And what I might say about this domain, what I think really summarizes this domain, it's all about the physical safety, the emotional safety, and the intellectual safety of not only our students, but also our staff members, and developing an awareness amongst our community members of what our expectations are regarding safety in our schools. And if we could move to slide 4, please. So with each of the domains, I've developed a list of questions that I think if you and your team, you and your superintendent, however you're structured, if you could think about how are you addressing these questions. This first domain, 4.1, is the safe environment domain. I did spend a little time before I put these questions together working and talking with some of our law enforcement in Rapid City, people with whom I've worked with for a number of years related to school safety, to make sure, number one, that I was asking the right questions and that our questions were current. I know procedures change with time. So some things that you need to think about, and these related, I know I sent as an attachment the 4.1 rubric, so you should have that there. That was one of the attachments, that safe environment rubric. So here are some things for you and your team to think about related to that. Do you have a school-wide crisis plan? And if so, with whom did you work to develop the plan? Did you consider law enforcement? Do you have a teacher leader team? Do you have some emergency management offices in your community that you could work with? Another consideration, if your school is a separate building from the district office, have you coordinated with the district office so that district office personnel have your plans readily available, so that if something were to happen and you were unable to communicate with people in the district office and they know there's a crisis in your building, if they have your crisis plans, they at least have an idea of the steps you're going to be taking in a crisis. Another consideration, if during a crisis in a building, and for whatever reasons the building level leaders were unable to communicate with district level administration or any other outside agency, what kind of plans do people have in place for who will take the lead and work with Typically, in a significant crisis, law enforcement takes over, but you would still need a lead from the district for communication purposes. In most districts, the superintendent would assume that role, but what if the superintendent's out of town? It's having that chain of command and knowing who takes the lead in a crisis if for whatever reasons that building principal can no longer do so, and there's no communication with the building. Another consideration, do local law enforcement agencies have blueprints or layouts of your building? Do they know how your building is constructed? Have you invited law enforcement to your building so that they're familiar with the building? One of the things that when I've worked with law enforcement and Homeland Security in Rapid City, was the recommendation that local law enforcement have blueprints of all your school buildings, so that if they had to send a team in, they would know what the layout of the building was. And then the final consideration for domain 4.1 is, and I bolded it, crisis plans should not be shared with the public. However, have you developed a communication plan and made families aware of that communication plan so they know what to expect and how to respond if a crisis occurs? Will they get their information through the local media? Do you have some kind of common cell phone text messaging system where you can get a quick text message out to your families? Can you get it on your website, your center voice, social media, calling trees? Those are all things to think about so that families don't panic. I think families can accept not knowing what your crisis plan is if they know how they will be communicated with to the best of your ability. And I realize you can't predict every situation. There's no way to write a crisis plan for every scenario, but you can have some basic communication plans in place so that our parents do know what to expect. If we could move to the next slide. Domain 4.2 is clear and consistent expectations. Some questions you might ask. Do you have a clear set of behavioral expectations, and are they aligned vertically and horizontally K-12? And I emphasize that because if you have a separate elementary, middle, and high school, when your children move from an elementary to a middle school, do they have to learn a whole new set of behavioral There's some consistency when they move from elementary to middle to high school, and do those expectations progress in an age-appropriate manner? How are you communicating your codes of conduct? You probably all have student handbooks. How do you share that? How do families know what those behavioral expectations are? Another question, especially when we get into the rubrics, do you have some way of tracking data, discipline data, so that you can look at trends in violations of codes of conduct, so that you can actually pinpoint if you have a certain number of behavioral issues, is there some particular area you need to look at and focus on? And really the only way to know that is to collect some data around those violations. And then, of course, the obvious next question is, how do you respond? Once you see a trend in behavior, how are you responding to that? How are you being proactive? And then I think another piece you're going to find in all of the rubrics, I've said this over and over again in all the trainings that I've done, how do you involve students and staff in the development of behavioral expectations? If you want your students and your families to have ownership, they have to be a part of that process. Matt, if we could move to the next slide, please. Domain 4.3. is student behavior management. Some questions to consider. Have you and your staff worked together to create and enforce common protocols for classrooms and common areas? Or do your teachers get to have their own set of expectations in their classroom, and are those expectations consistent with the teacher next door? Do you have kids moving through the course of a day in every class they go to, especially at a middle and a high school? They face and have to deal with a different set of behavioral expectations. Do the protocols that you've put together to deal with standards of behavior, for example, I know at many of our elementaries there is a protocol for how students move down the hallway, how they transition to different areas within the building. Are those protocols consistent with your codes of conduct? How are you monitoring the effectiveness of your behavioral plan and the common protocols that you've developed to know if they're successful? Are you, again, that question you're going to hear over and over again, are you seeking input from students and parents related to the effectiveness of your plans and your common protocols? And finally, have you considered the implementation of a program such as the PBIS program? I talked with or emailed with the DOE a little bit on that this week, and I know that PBIS is being integrated into the MTSS process, and I know that the PBIS training is free through that process, but from what I've gathered, this year is booked, and I think next year is booked with schools requesting training. But some kind of common program that is systemic with regard to how you deal with behaviors in classrooms and common areas. Domain 4.4 is conflict resolution. Some considerations. Have you and your staff participated in any kind of training related to conflict resolution? Have you and your staff worked with students so they're able to self-manage and appropriately resolve conflicts without adult intervention? I think you'll find today when we get into looking at the rubrics more closely, when we get into that proficient and distinguished level of the rubrics, there's that consistent message about teaching our students to self-manage and resolve their conflicts at the lowest level before they have to bring them to an adult. And that's not to say that they shouldn't bring certain conflicts to adults. Obviously, there are conflicts that need to be brought forward, but there are also just those day-to-day kid conflicts is what I like to call them that need to be, kids need to learn how to manage those. Have you developed some processes or procedures by which conflicts are resolved starting at the lowest level? Some tiered plan of following how a conflict is resolved. If it doesn't get resolved at the student level, then what's the process to move it to the next level and the next level? So what I've done, if we could move slides, and you might want to enlarge your screen a little bit. I know my print is small here, but I wanted to be able to get this onto the slides, and I know if you received the PowerPoint from me as an email, and I sent everybody a copy of the PowerPoint, you should be able to enlarge your screen to see the print. One of the things I've tried to do here, and there will be a series of these slides on each of the components. I know when you look at the actual rubrics in your Principal Effectiveness Handbook, they tend to be vertical in nature, and I know when I first started working with the rubrics, I had to really spend some time with the rubrics to get that big picture look of what does this component look like for a basic principle, a proficient principle, and a distinguished principle. So these next few slides really are summaries, quick looks at what does a safe environment look like at the basic level, at the proficient level, and the distinguished level of leadership. And I've underlined key words so that it's easier to see that progression. So, for example, in this particular component, safe environment, the principal does have routines and policies for school safety. However, you'll note the underlined phrase, he or she probably only intermittently supervises the implementation. Probably addresses the issues fairly quickly, constructively, promotes a safe environment, but I think the key at this basic level is that intermittent supervision. And then if you move to that proficient level, you see we go from intermittent to routinely supervises implementation, and then you add in this piece of how is cultural diversity and how are divergent opinions factored in to those policies and procedures, so that it isn't just a physically safe environment, it's an emotionally safe environment. When you get to that proficient level, there's a plan in place. It isn't just policies and procedures, but there's a systemic plan in place that addresses all of those issues. And then you'll note when you get to the distinguished column, and always when we get to the distinguished column in any component, stakeholders are involved in the process. It isn't just the principal, it's the principal and the teachers, the principal and our families, and you're going to see repeatedly, are stakeholders trained? Are they empowered to take responsibility for their behavior? And that's that real distinction between proficient and distinguished is stakeholder involvement. I'm going to pause for just a second, and Matt, do we have any questions that have come up yet? Okay, I'm not going to go through this slide verbatim, this next slide, if you could go to the next slide. But what I've done for you, and there's a slide with each component, here are a list of artifacts and how artifact progression might look. So if you're at that basic level as a principal, here are the artifacts you probably have. If you move, however, to the proficient level, what additional artifacts might you need to put you into that next level? And then if you move to the distinguished level, what are more artifacts or evidence that you might have to provide? And I always would like to emphasize when I use the term artifacts, I don't necessarily just mean a piece of paper or a collection of documents that a principal puts in a binder. Artifacts are not just those documents, but they're observable evidence. It might be something you can see on a website. It might be whoever's evaluating the principal has visited the building and he or she observes how kids move to and from classrooms, has been in classrooms and actually is seeing those safety policies and procedures in action. So it isn't just paper and pencil artifacts, it's observable evidence as well. If we could move to the next slide. And again, I've done the same thing. I've tried to summarize what the principal looks like at each level. This is, if you're looking at your rubrics, and I sent those to you alongside, you're looking at clear and consistent expectations. So that basic principle has distributed written communications about behavioral expectations and enforces the codes of conduct. But when you move to that proficient principle, he or she is communicating in multiple forms to all stakeholders, and consistently enforces the codes of conduct. And a real distinction here is this proficient principal holds the adults in the building accountable for consistent enforcement of student expectations. So for example, if you have a staff of 40, do 35 teachers enforce the codes of conduct and 5 just ignore? And how does the principal hold all the adults accountable to all of the expectations? And then that distinguished principal has actually linked behavioral expectations to the mission and the vision, looks at trends, develops initiatives that might reduce incidences, behavioral incidences, and involves staff and students in developing new expectations. So again, that stakeholder involvement comes into that distinguished column. And in this particular component, that connection to the mission and vision and looking at data and trends. As with component 4.1, and I'm not going to read through this slide, you can do that. I've given a sample progression of artifacts. How might the artifacts look at each level? How does that artifact, how do those artifacts build on one another as you move from one level to the next? Component 4.3 is student behavior management. And I think you should be hearing and seeing a trend here with all of the components. At this basic level, teachers have to have rules for student behavior, and they have to have standards of conduct, but each teacher can have his or her own at that basic level. And there's the occasional monitoring. At the proficient level, there are a common set of behavioral expectations for both classrooms and common areas, and the routine monitoring of behaviors. And then that distinguished level is that single school culture, that systemic model for behavior. And the best example I can give for that is, and I know I keep coming back to that, is that PBIS model, which is a real systemic model for behavior that really helps to create a single school culture. If you implement the PBIS model, you're collecting data, you're monitoring data, you're involving families. And certainly PBIS is not the only model out there. There are other models. I just use that as an example, but some model that helps you create a single school culture for behavior and behavioral expectations. And 4.3, again, is that progression of artifacts. See how they build on one another. 4.4 is that conflict resolution piece. And there are some interesting distinctions here when you get into this particular component. And I wanted to add here, when we started off the conversation this afternoon and we talked about school safety and those crisis plans that we build, I think we all know, too, that while we can't prevent every crisis in our building, we can't always predict when a student is going to do something unexpected and dangerous. I think we all do know, though, that if we try to create within our buildings safe environments where students feel physically, emotionally, and intellectually safe, and we have this culture of respect and safety in our building, that that intrinsic culture really goes a long way toward preventing those major kinds of crises. It certainly doesn't prevent them all, and there's never a guarantee. One of the principals that I've worked with for many years consistently says, while we have our crisis plans and we practice them and we have all these expectations in place, and while we've communicated to our families clearly, we simply can't predict or necessarily prevent that one isolated incident. They happen. But it helps to have that culture of safety. So in this particular component, the basic principle resolves disputes quickly and constructively, and listens to all point of views. But if you look at that proficient level, that principle tries to understand what the cause of the conflict is, not just here's the conflict and here's how we're going to resolve it, but what caused it so that the conflict doesn't reoccur. That helping the people who are in conflict understand each other's position, and helping them to accept an option or understand and accept an option for resolution. And certainly, I know you all know from your experiences out there, as do I, this is not always easy to do when you're mediating conflict between adults and between students. The hardest part, I think, of mediating those conflicts is helping them to understand the other person's position, and then helping both parties or multiple parties to accept a resolution to that. And then that distinguished principle doesn't just seek to understand, but analyzes the conflicts to get to the cause. And the other distinction at the distinguished level is that this principle works with staff so that students learn to manage their own conflicts more appropriately. And then this distinguished principle uses data, looks at data to try to implement processes and procedures to prevent conflicts from occurring. And if we could move to the next slide. Again, the progression of artifacts that go with each level. And Matt, if we could go on to the next slide. This is pulled from your Principal Effectiveness Handbook. This slide and the next slide is a list of sample artifacts that a principal might use as evidence to support where he or she might be with regard to a specific component. I was working with a district the other day. This is certainly not, I want to clarify this, you don't have to have every one of these artifacts. I want to make that clear. This is just a sample list. There are many more out there, other artifacts and other pieces of evidence, but just because an artifact is on this list doesn't mean you have to have everything on the list of artifacts. I've encountered a little confusion about that out there, so I wanted to clarify that today. One of the, if we could move to the next slide, one of the things that I've done here is I want to make sure also with each of these components that you see how these components are connected to the other work you're doing. So this first slide is a crosswalk from principal effectiveness to the teacher effectiveness model, so that you can see here are the 4 components in Domain 4, and on the right are the teacher effectiveness components that align with those. So if you're working with your teachers on managing student behavior, classroom procedures, creating an environment of respect and rapport, that work aligns with the work you're doing as a principal. And if you and your staff can connect those pieces, I think it makes the work easier, and it certainly the work is going to be more effective if you're working together. So I want to emphasize that connection between the two, that crosswalk between the teacher effectiveness model, the Danielson model, and the principal effectiveness model. This is just the same crosswalk in reverse. So if you were working with your teachers on developing a school-wide plan, behavioral plan, systemic plan, it might help your teachers to see, here are the domains that they work on, here are the components they work on in the classroom environment, and here are the things you as a principal work on to support them and how those go together. So the crosswalk goes both ways. It might be easier if you're working with staff for them to look at this crosswalk so that they see the domains that they're accustomed to working with first. And then we have schools out there that work with the turnaround principles. And so we've done a turnaround crosswalk, and I sent that document to all of you, but I thought it might be helpful if you could see specifically, here are the turnaround principles that match up with the domain 4. So for example, turnaround principle 2627, all teachers interact with students to build positive relationships, lines up with 4.1, the safe environment, or down below at the bottom, turnaround principle 165, all teachers reinforce classroom rules and procedures by positively teaching them, directly lines up with 4.3, which is the student behavior management we just talked about. We really think it's important for you to see how all the work that we're doing ties together. And then I always like to put in at the end, you've seen this slide many, many times, but it's that link to the teacher principal effectiveness website with the DOE. All the documents we've talked about today are all reside there. These webinars, Matt's been posting the webinars as we complete them. So are there any questions at this point? Type them in. I think Matt's going to unmute if you have any questions.
It's going to make us mute for a second.
Okay. Are there any questions out there, or you out there, you all have many, many experiences collectively that far exceed mine. Is there anything you would like to add to what we've talked about today?